hoisted my gear to rearrange it on my shoulders, lowered my head, and took my place in line. I wondered if the owners would return and find it lying there. According to the map, we reached the trenches approximately 3 miles from the other company, yet the actual walking distance as we wound through the maze was hard to judge. The rain increased and the silence was broken only by the punctuation of the raindrops crackling against our ponchos. I was fine with the silence. I didn't feel like talking to anyone anyway. The walls of earth on either side of us were tall enough that all I could see above were the distant ridges of the valley, the rest of my surroundings a slick, oily mess of brown, green, and gray. Here and there I saw something that looked like a boot, sometimes a hand, poking out from a pile of rubble that had taken a direct hit. Once we came to a place that looked like a T-intersection, but we found that to the left a mass grave had been dug. We stopped for a moment despite the smell and stared silently. At the far end the stack was up to my chest. Some faces were frozen in mid-yell with looks of anger, some surprised, some just sad, and all of them were dirty with eyes that focused in faraway places. There were mostly American and German uniforms in the pile. At least the rain was keeping the flies down. Beckett was the first to turn away, and he looked down at Joe, who had sat down and been watching him as he waited. Beckett cleared his throat and headed down the corridor to the right, and the rest of us followed. It was easy to spot the men who hadn't seen much death until then. They were the ones looking nervously over their shoulders, as if all those corpses would get up and follow us. I was sure that some of them would be haunted by it. I know it had me on edge, because I imagined us taking a wrong turn as we pressed on, rounding another corner right into a group of surprised enemy soldiers. The fading light that blended dull colors together only added to my uneasiness. My finger moved closer to the trigger. As we rounded a bend, I tensed, glimpsing the distinct curve of reflected light that could only be a helmet. I was still holding my breath when the sentry grunted softly as he saluted Beckett and then quietly explained how much further away the rest of the company waited. Silent nods were exchanged as we passed by and left him to his duty. When we arrived, Beckett, the other captain, and a few other men of rank from both companies immediately huddled together for a briefing. Joe sat in the mud right in the heart of it all and watched patiently, filthy and soaked to the bone, but not seeming to mind. The situation was much as we'd expected. The Germans were still somewhere in the trench across no man's land, and they'd been trapped there since only a few days before we started out, trapped by the company we'd just rendezvoused with. We had the upper hand, and not only were the German soldiers cornered, they had been cut off from any help or supply lines. Even on minimal rations, there was no way they could stretch their resources thin enough to last much longer. It seemed obvious that our orders were to wait them out now that there was nothing they could do. It was getting late, and the rain grew to a downpour. Beckett gave the order to divvy out our extra rations to the other company before settling in for the wait. He quietly spread the word that no one mentioned the apples. I handed out my last extra ration and quickly returned to a small nook built slightly into the wall of the trench, a spot I saw when we arrived, but Prescott had beaten me to the place. He looked up as I neared, but I ignored him and walked past, settling for a place near a small stone fashioned into a step made for peering over the top of the wall, and I shed my gear. I sat down and leaned forward, placing my elbows on my knees and rubbing my eyes with the heels of my hand. All I wanted to do was take off my boots, but the rain and muck made that a bad idea. I had a hard time imagining anything filthier than sitting in a trench. Everything that comes from a body, alive or dead, mixed together into a soup when it rained and there was nowhere for it to drain out. There were always soldiers who lost their heads and took their boots off anyway, working tender areas and wincing at sores, but some beat the odds and weren't affected. Some weren't so lucky, and once they showed symptoms, they were on borrowed time. I wanted a cigarette to keep my mind off my feet, but it was too wet. I thought about eating an apple to occupy myself, but I didn't want to catch hell from Beckett. We hadn't been in the trenches long enough anyway. I hadn't gotten used to the smell yet. I tipped my helmet forward and settled in. Prescott took great pains to build a makeshift tent on a narrow ledge by taking off his poncho and attaching it to his rucksack. He fastened the other corner to his rifle and propped that at an angle against the wall. It seemed to do the trick, creating a cover from the rain, and he'd left enough material to create a flap that hung over for privacy. I watched the entire process and wondered if any soldiers had died right where he lay, biting in the air as they fell like the dog he shot. The more I thought about it, the madder I became. Next to my seat was a rock, oblong in shape and about 3 inches thick through the middle. I picked it up and lobbed it underhand onto Prescott's tent, collapsing it. He erupted into a confused mass of arms, legs, and poncho. Prescott never raised his voice, but the racket he made was enough to draw everyone's attention. After untangling himself, he looked straight at me, and I held his gaze without remorse. "What in hell did you do that for?" Prescott said between clenched teeth. "Just think," I answered. "If that was a grenade, we'd have seen it in time to get cover and watch you be blown to bits." "We may all be blown to bits if you ladies keep it up and give away our position," Beckett chimed in. Prescott's look turned angrier, as this jab was not only aimed at me this time, but also included him. "Feels good, doesn't it?" I thought. After a short silence, Beckett called my name. I shouldered my pack on one side, my rifle on the other, and moved over to him. He finished mumbling something to the other captain as I arrived, and then he turned to me. "Your stunt just gave me an idea," he said. The last thing I wanted was to be included in any of the captain's ideas. "Give me one of your apples." "What? Why?" I forgot my rank for a moment. "Give me a damn apple, soldier," he snapped. Apparently he'd seen me sneak mine after all. I opened the flap where I kept my meager stash and held one out. "Roll it around in the mud first," he said. I looked at him for a moment, but his face was blank. Confused, I dropped it in the muck and rolled it around before handing it to him. It was mostly covered, but there were still hints of red underneath. Beckett hefted it in his hand, a look of concentration on his face as he placed one foot onto a block of wood next to the muddy wall. Placing his hand on the wall, he leaned back and threw the apple over no man's land. We leaned forward and held our breaths. A dull thud in the distance. Maybe he was trying to lure the Germans out of the trench and into our sights. Whatever he was up to, he attracted the attention of the rest of the men, who began to move closer out of curiosity. Everyone sat in silence and waited. Soon we heard a weak voice call out, accompanied with what sounded like a moan. "Bitte mehr Äpfel! Haben Sie mehr Äpfel?" "So hungrig," another voice wailed. "What did they say?" someone behind me asked. "They asked for more apples," said another. "Then let's oblige them," said Beckett, and held his hand out. No one else moved, so I grabbed one more apple and swore silently through my teeth as I prepared it. Beckett repeated his first toss. Another thud. Before there was time for more pleas, Beckett motioned for yet another apple and told me to get one for the other captain and myself as well. I handed over the muddy fruit and watched these disappear in a high arc, fuming over the fact that I only had 2 left. "That should have them thinking with their stomachs now," said Beckett. Pointing at me and a few others, he ordered us to spread out along the wall, take 1 grenade each, and cover them in mud like the apples. I felt sick as I realized how Beckett had twisted my harmless prank on Prescott. Rather than wait for the starving soldiers to surrender, Beckett had to take this last opportunity for glory, and the brass in Washington would probably give him a medal for it. "You know the drill. On my mark, pull the pin, count off 3 seconds and throw, but keep them straight. By now they should be ready to fight each other for these apples," he said, "but we need to cover as large an area as possible because we still don't know for sure how many of them there are." The rest of his orders were directed at the others. "Get yourselves to where you can scramble out of this trench as fast as you can. As soon as you hear those blasts, I want you up and out. If they aren't dead, then they'll be disoriented, so we need to finish this quickly." We watched Beckett, and he counted down from 5 to 2 with one hand, nodded once, and then pulled his pin as we did the same. 3 seconds lasted forever. We lobbed our grenades as one and watched this last batch of fruit disappear into the haze, squinting into the rain. Everybody else turned and ducked their heads, and after another moment I finally turned and joined them as we waited. I heard each raindrop as it fell. With my head down, I noticed Joe sitting and facing us, his head cocked sideways and ears perked, oblivious to the rain. The sound of the screams came to us an instant before the explosions. Joe leaped backwards in fright, slamming himself solidly into the opposite wall of the trench. With lips pulled back to show fangs, he instinctively followed the tide of soldiers that stormed up the steps into no man's land, scrambling and clawing up the makeshift brick and wooden steps. Their eyes all looked panicked. Joe was quicker than the soldiers, but seemed to realize too late that he climbed out of the trench in the wrong direction. He bolted aimlessly, tripping soldiers as they raced to reach the Germans. Scattered rifle reports rang out and screams came from everywhere. The bodies of men who had been standing next to me fell while others dove for cover. Some landed in the open and tried desperately to crawl out of the path of the stray bullets. My head pounded, and I could hear my breath in my ears. Joe streaked back and forth, invincible. Without thinking, I raised my rifle and lined the target up in my sight. I pulled the trigger and saw the bullet knock Joe off his feet. He bit the air once, and his body landed crumpled in the mud. I set the rifle down, reached for a grenade, and pulled the pin.